Okay, good evening, and thank you for coming out on this cold Colorado evening. Welcome to our event on the crisis in U.S. Iran relations. My name is Nader Hashmi. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies, and this event tonight is part of our lecture series on the 40th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution. We've invited 4 social scientists to the University of Denver to help us interpret and analyze this topic, along with one distinguished diplomat, our guest tonight, Ambassador John Limbert. The format will be a public conversation between Ambassador Limbert and myself, followed by a question and answer session. Ambassador John Limbert is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iran in the U.S. State Department's Bureau for Near Eastern Affairs. He's a veteran U.S. diplomat, former official at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, where he was held captive during the Iran hostage crisis in 1979-1980 for 444 days, a seminal event in U.S.-Iran relations. It was a big part of my own personal life and, of course, Ambassador Limbert's personal and professional life as well. Ambassador Limbert first joined the Foreign Service in 1973. His overseas experiences have included tours in Algeria, Djibouti, Sudan, Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. He was one of the first civilian officials to enter Baghdad after April 2003. He also held the position of Deputy Coordinator for Counterterrorism in the U.S. State Department in the year 2000. Ambassador Limbert has a Ph.D. from Harvard University in History and Middle Eastern Studies, and before joining the Foreign Service, he taught in Iran as a Peace Corps volunteer in the mid-1960s and as an English instructor at Shiraz University in the early 1970s, and currently Ambassador John Limbert is a distinguished professor of international affairs at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. And so it's a huge honor to have Ambassador Limbert here today. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
My pleasure, really.
And I can't think really of a better person to be here at the University of Denver tonight to discuss this topic, given recent developments. Now, it just so happens, we didn't plan it this way, but it just so happens that today is the 1-year anniversary of President Trump's announcement to withdraw from the Iran nuclear agreement and to impose new sanctions on the Islamic Republic of Iran that has resulted in an effective collapse of the Iranian economy. Today is also the day where Iran announced that it is beginning to limit its compliance with the Iran nuclear accord, and it's now given Europe 60 days to act to try and protect Iran from U.S. sanctions, or Iran claims it will resume production of highly enriched uranium, thus shortening the breakout time needed to build a nuclear weapon. Today also, incidentally, Donald Trump announced a new series of sanctions on Iran's mining industry. And of course, last month, the White House officially declared Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps a foreign terrorist organization. And of course, on Sunday, it was announced that the United States is sending an aircraft carrier and a bomber strike force to the Persian Gulf to, quote, send a clear and unmistakable message to Iran. So, Ambassador Limbert, it looks like we're headed to war with Iran. Is there anything that can be done to stop it?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you very much for inviting me here. Let me thank Professor Hashmi and Professor Grappo, whose class I had the pleasure of talking to today, and what a wonderful group of students you have here at Denver. Are we on a course for war with Iran? I would hope not. We and the Iranians have been in this situation of no war, no peace for about 40 years. I mean, for 40 years, I like to say that we've been on this together. We've been on a road to nowhere. And I think I was there when that road was built, and when the contract was let. We've stood on opposite sides of an abyss. and we have glared at each other, we have threatened each other, we've called each other names, insulted each other, accused each other of all sorts of things. We are the great Satan, we are world arrogance, they are the world's #1 sponsor of terrorism, they are a rogue regime, you name it. And I have asked myself, 40 years of this, what has it accomplished? We're still on that damn road. And we're still there. And we're still looking at the possibility of war. The possibility of war. Wars begin usually with both sides claiming they don't want it. And then they fall into it. What I worry about is some incident in the Persian Gulf. You notice I call it the Persian Gulf. Place where I work, the U.S. Navy somehow insisted on calling it the Arabian Gulf. I don't know where that came from, but they do. But some kind of an incident involving, for example, a U.S. Navy ship and a Revolutionary Guard gunboat, fast boat. These boats, according to my Navy friends, are not handled or driven very responsibly. My suspicion is what the Revolutionary Guards have done for their Navy is to go and recruit Tehran taxi drivers. If you've ever ridden in a taxi in Tehran, you'll know what I mean. Death-defying doesn't begin to describe it. The trick is how close can you come to catastrophe without there. And if that happens right now, there is no channel of communication to diffuse this. A few years ago, in the previous administration, we seemed to be making progress, establishing channels of communication, looking for a different way, a way off the road, but we seem to be we're back where we were for 40 years, and maybe even in a worse place. And it would appear to me that there are groups, individuals, interests, not only here but in other countries, that are determined to fuel that conflict, and that's what we seem to be seeing. We have been seeing over the past months, and particularly in recent days.
So Iran announced today that it's going to give Europe 60 days to try and come up with a plan to protect Iran from the effects of U.S. sanctions, or Iran will begin to gradually start to enrich uranium and produce heavy water that's needed for a plutonium weapon. I'm of the view that the Europeans are not going to be able to come to Iran's rescue. I don't see any path forward, which means in 60 days, John Bolton will have a perfect excuse to move things forward on what seems to be a plan for regime change. So what happens in 60 days? I mean, I guess the question is this: what can be done to stop this concretely, that can be done to stop this slow and steady spiral to war? Can Congress do anything? Can American citizens do anything?
Let me talk about sanctions for a minute, because actually the push for sanctions began in 1979. And Iran has been under one kind of sanction or another for a very long time. It hasn't resulted in any changes of policy, as far as I'm aware. Iran is still there, and the Islamic Republic is still as hostile as ever. A few years ago, I took a group of students up to New York to meet with the members of the Iranian mission to the UN. It's the one official Iranian presence in this country. And they gave us a briefing, and they started off by saying, you have to understand the basis of our foreign policy. And the basis of our foreign policy is opposition to you. Well, that's pretty clear, if not very pleasant. But that's what it's been, and that's what it remains. And 40 years of sanctions We call them crippling, we call them smart, we call them this, we call them that. Frankly, hasn't done a damn thing. But we keep doing them. Let me just tell a story. Can I just tell a quick story about sanctions? During my brief and somewhat inglorious tenure as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iran back at the beginning of the Obama administration, what I found was it was in our government, it was all sanctions all the time. That's all we talked about. Sanctions took all the air out of the room, and the idea of doing anything else never occurred to anybody. So I was getting more and more frustrated at these meetings when all they wanted to do was talk about sanctions. So I said, okay, let me make a point here. I'm gonna show the absurdity of this. So I said, people were going around the table and they were saying, what other sanctions can we think of? So I said, why don't we sanction Iran for violating the International Convention Against Cannibalism? And I thought I was making a joke. And the reaction was, that's interesting. That's an interesting idea. Why didn't we think of that before? And I'm sort of tearing my hair out at this point. But nobody cared what the effect of this thing, the effects of these things were. Nobody cared what the effects certainly didn't care about the effects on ordinary Iranians, about whom we claim to care about who we claim to worry about. Nobody cared about that. As far as I could tell, it was a feel-good exercise. We did it because it made us feel good. It made us feel self-righteous. So yeah, we're going to see more and more sanctions. And I think the Iranians, from what I can tell, have sort of picked this up. And their view is, it doesn't matter what we do. The Americans are on this path, and they're going to keep imposing sanctions.
So again, what happens in 60 days when Iran begins to start enriching uranium?
I would like to think they're not going to fall into the trap. But you can see the trap that's out there, which is to say, the Iranians are after the bomb. Are after the bomb. Let me just say one thing about that. I'm sorry. Once you get, I should comment. Once you get me wound up on this subject and get going, it's hard to stop. It's hard to stop. But on this issue of it was never clear to me, and it was never clear to a lot of observers just what the Iranian nuclear program was about. The Iranians insisted it was entirely peaceful. Others said no. The different groups of inspectors said this or said that. So I was at a session back in 2011 or so, 2012, in New York with President Ahmadinejad. And someone asked him, "Is Iran seeking a nuclear weapon?" And his answer, I thought, was very interesting. He said, "We are not, because it is against. There is a religious opinion against it. It is dangerous. It is politically doesn't achieve anything for us. It's expensive, and all these reasons that he gave that they were not seeking a nuclear weapon." He said, but the most important reason, but beyond that, the decision to build or not build a nuclear weapon is our decision. It is not the decision of the United States. It is not the decision of the United Nations. It is not the decision of the European community. Nobody else's decision. You can't tell us what to do. Sound familiar? Anybody ever raise a teenager? And of course, what this taps into, in anyone familiar with Iranian history and Iranian political culture, is this deep sense of grievance and deep sense of having been exploited and controlled by outsiders. In other words, his statement was, we now decide our own destiny, not you. And that, to me, was the more important point, rather than, are we building a bomb or not?
Given your vast understanding of this topic,
I love the flattery, by the way, the vast understanding of my vast understanding.
more so than anyone in this room, I suspect. But I was wondering if you could try to explain to us, in your own words, what U.S. policy toward Iran is today under the Trump administration, or I should say under the Trump/Bolton/Pompeo administration toward Iran. How would you characterize it?
Well, let me think. I mean, Iranians love to flatter you, so please, thank you very much. Actually, to be an expert about Iran is not very hard. All you have to do is to be able to say two things. One, if someone asks you a question, you say, one, I don't know, and the second is, it's very complicated. And that will do 90. That will do in 90%. 90% of the cases. What is the policy? There isn't one. Beyond a sense of we don't like the Islamic Republic. A lot of people don't like the Islamic Republic. It's not my favorite form of government. Not my favorite form of government either. We don't like the Islamic Republic, and probably more to the point, we dislike everything that Obama did. And we want to feel good. So we want to feel self-righteous. What did Obama referred to something one time? I really liked it. The satisfying purity of indignation. Do you remember this? He used that in his Oslo acceptance speech. He talked about and that's where we are. We're with the satisfying purity of indignation. No one seems to ask, what does this accomplish? What do we want? Do we want to? If we want to smash Iran's economy, if we want to ruin Iran's economy, why? What's the point of doing that? Secretary Pompeo, in his speech a few months ago in Southern California, seemed to ask the Iranian people to go out in the street and get themselves slaughtered in a new uprising. One comment I saw from an Iranian in Tehran was, he's asking us to overthrow this government so that this cultish authoritarian group known as the MEK can come in and take over. Well, I'm sorry, the Iranian said, I'm sorry, we're not going to do that. I don't see a coherent policy. I see different people pursuing different directions. But if you don't have a policy, if you don't have a goal, then it's easy. Remember in Alice in Wonderland, what was it the Cheshire Cat says? If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And that seems where we are. I don't see a coherent policy. Some people may want to see some completely new regime in Tehran. Maybe somebody wants to see it surrender. Maybe somebody wants to see it collapse. Others talk about division of the country. To me, that would be a catastrophe. That would be an absolute catastrophe for the United States. But I don't see anything particularly coherent coming out of U.S. policy.
Okay, well, let me play devil's advocate and try and provide some coherency to the Trump administration's Iran policy. I think its defenders would say the following. Roughly a year ago, at the Heritage Foundation, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo listed 12 demands, 12 goals that the Trump administration had toward Iran. very quickly. Number one, declare to the International Atomic Energy Agency a full account of prior military dimensions to Iran's nuclear program, stop enrichment and never pursue plutonium reprocessing, provide the IAEA with unqualified access to all sites throughout the entire country, end proliferation of ballistic missiles, and halt further launching of the development of nuclear-capable missile systems, release all U.S. citizens that are in Iranian jails, end support for Middle East terror groups such as Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, respect the sovereignty of the Iraqi government, and permit the disarming, demobilization, and reintegration of Shia militias, end its support for the Houthi rebels in Yemen, withdraw all Iranian forces in Syria, end support for the Taliban and other terrorists in Afghanistan, stop harboring al-Qaeda leaders, end the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps linked goods force support for terrorists and militant partners around the world, and finally end its threatening behavior against its neighbors, many of whom are U.S. allies, including its threats to destroy Israel. Now, many Americans would listen to these 12 demands and say, they sound perfectly reasonable to me. Why not pursue them?
You know what this reminds me of? I'm basically, by training, I'm a historian, and by various accidents of history in the academic job market, did not become an academic. It reminds me of the ultimatum that the Austro-Hungarians gave to the Serbs after the assassination of the Archduke, where basically said, yes, if you surrender completely, then everything will be fine. Will be fine. This is not a negotiation, as I understand it. This is a call for surrender. Yes, some of these things would be nice to achieve. For example, releasing Americans. I mean, that's very close to me. That's very close to my own heart, because I've been through that. I've been through that and know what these people are suffering. The question is, how do you get there? For 30-some years, there is such a profession. There is such a thing as diplomacy. And diplomacy, it's a way of achieving ends through mutual communication. It seems to me that what our esteemed Secretary of State is saying is, we're giving up on diplomacy. We're telling you what we want, and that's it. And if you don't do it, you face the consequences. This does not fall into any known definition of diplomacy or negotiation, as I think most of us in this room would understand it.
Okay, let me ask you to address another dimension of this problem with respect to Iran's regional behavior and the contrast between the Obama administration's approach to Iran's regional behavior versus the Trump administration's approach. So on the 28th of March of this year, in the New York Times, Ben Hubbard published an article called "Iran's Allies Feel the Pain of American Sanctions," where it was reported that as a direct result of Trump's policies of sanctioning Iran, preventing it from selling its oil, it no longer had the resources to support various militias in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. And those militias and those groups themselves, including Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, were now complaining publicly about the effect of U.S. sanctions, thus suggesting that the Trump policy of trying to hurt the Iranian economy was putting some constraints on Iran's regional behavior. Isn't that some indication, or can't the Trump administration claim some justification that its sanctions and its policy is restricting Iran's regional role?
Let me make 2 points. One, I'm very reluctant, I'm very uneasy with the use of the word behavior in this context. Behavior to me says, it's a very condescending word. It's a very condescending phrase. It's something you use with animals and children. Anybody who's been in any kind of a relationship knows how effective it would be to say, everything in this relationship would be fine if you would just change your behavior. What do you think the effect of that would be? I don't think it would work very well. I don't think it would work very well. This is not an effective way of acting. Unfortunately, that kind of thing has has slipped into our vocabulary, and to the effect that the radical says the Iranian government has to change, the regime has to change. The moderate, the reasonable person says the behavior has to change. It used to be a while back that a moderate under the Bush administration used to say moderate was someone who said we have to bomb Iran tomorrow. That was the moderate. Now, what happened? To get back to your point, a lot of this kind of reporting falls into a category I sort of call wishful thinking or self-fulfilling prophecy. Something is true because you want it to be true. It's like the effect of sanctions. What effect of these sanctions? What is the relationship between the sanctions and the financing or the sponsoring of terrorist groups abroad? We don't know, and anyone who claims to know, I'm very suspicious of. It's rather like you know the old joke about the man who walks around snapping his fingers, and they ask him, "Why do you do that?" And he says, "To keep the elephants away." And they say to him, "But there are no elephants within 5,000 miles. You see? It works." The establishing cause and effect in this is not easy, and it's not as straightforward. I don't know the gentleman who wrote the article maybe is a very reputable journalist, but I wonder how much he can establish that. Yeah, we can make life difficult for the Islamic Republic, but we have done that for 40 years, and life has been and the victims of misguided policy in Tehran have been ordinary Iranians. I mean, they're the ones who had to suffer through shortages. They're the ones who have to suffer through had to deal with mismanagement, corruption, repression, war, the destruction of the war, and so does that. I suspect, but I don't have any particular insight, but I suspect in the current Iranian ruling system, if it's a choice of where to spend the resources, spending them on sponsoring foreign groups is pretty high up on their priority list, unfortunately.
Let me shift gears slightly and talk about diplomatic relations. Let's assume that we get beyond this crisis moment. We get beyond, let's say, the Trump administration, and we have a new president in 2020, 2021. I'm of the view that the biggest obstacle to diplomatic relations between the United States and the Islamic Republic, the biggest obstacle actually lies in Tehran, not in Washington. And I say that because there is something about the very identity of Iranian hardliners that make it impossible for them to, I think, contemplate normalized relations. There's a lot of evidence to suggest this. I could go through the record. Just to cite one example among many, the Supreme Leader was speaking, as he often does, and he was, reflecting on who his successor would be. And he said, I'm paraphrasing him, that the next Supreme Leader might have a different governing style, a different sort of area of emphasis. But he said that one thing that he hopes will not change and that should not change is strong opposition and animosity to the United States of America and its policies. So the point here is that while, just to summarize, while here in the United States, diplomatic relations with Iran is controversial, it can be polarizing. Inside the Islamic Republic of Iran, the question of diplomatic relations is an existential question of survival for the Iranian hardliners who use anti-Americanism to rally their base together, to condemn any opposition, any opponents as being CIA agents. To contemplate diplomatic relations between these two countries, given the current structure of power in the Islamic Republic of Iran seems to me impossible. Something would have to change on the Iranian end, which is why I'm very skeptical of that happening as long as that current structure of power stays in place. What do you think of my theory?
Nader, I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree with you. All of what you say is true. But on the other hand, nothing is forever. I mean, we have a history in the U.S. of estrangement with countries, and eventually we find ways to talk to each other. We did this with China. We did this with the Soviet Union. We've done it even with Cuba. We've done it with Vietnam, North Korea. We're talking more with North Korea with North Korea now. In the case of Iran, yes. I mean, I personally, and others maybe in this room, were a victim of this kind of blind, to call it blind anti-Americanism, where it overshadowed any thought of what is really what is in the national interest. What was in the interest was obviously survival or prospering of a certain group of politicians. On the other hand, this group there's since 1979, about the same group of 25 people has ruled the country. I mean, they took over in January, February of '79, and they've stayed. The only way they leave is by dying. Some of them are so old. I think of who was it? The head of the Council, Assembly of Experts. Is it Ayatollah Janati, whom they call Namirul Mu'mineen, the one who refuses to die? They say he's so old that if you go into his smartphone, you'll find numbers for Cain and Abel in there. These guys don't live. On the other hand, what's their priority? Their priority is survival. They like being in power. They like their palaces. They like their chauffeured limousines. They like this stuff. They like this stuff. And the alternative is unpleasant. And they will do whatever they need to do to stay in power. Now, if that means sending hundreds of thousands of young men to die in the swamps of southern Iraq or southern Iran, they'll do that. If it means executing thousands of prisoners, they'll do that. On the other hand, if it means maybe just changing this anti-Americanism, they will do that as well. My own feeling is whenever we and the Iranians figure out, that it's really that we start talking to each other in a productive way, as we did seem to be getting to do in 2015, 2016, so forth. We're going to sit down and we're going to look at ourselves and ask ourselves, why the hell did we spend so much time hating each other? Why did we waste all that time? I mean, I grew up in a time when we feared the Chi-Coms. Anybody here remember that expression for the Chinese for the red? I mean, boy, we were terrible. They were the worst. These things can change. These things can change. And that's, again, that's part of the practice of diplomacy. That's part of the practice of negotiation. If changing this anti-American policy becomes in the interests of survival of those in charge of the Islamic Republic, in which the great majority of the population now is young, savvy, well-educated, has no memory of the revolution, I think they'll do it.
They might change the policy to resolve differences over, let's say, the nuclear issue, but I'm talking about normalized relations. Normalized relations with Iranian hardliners running the ship of state, in my view, is inconceivable. I mean, I don't want to belabor the point, and I think there's actually something fundamentally different about Cuba-U.S. relations and Iran-U.S. relations that inhibit the Iranian side from even contemplating this option that doesn't apply to the Cubans, doesn't apply to the Vietnamese.
Well, I hope you're not right. You may be.
Yeah.
On the other hand, in my experience, I found that a lot of former hardliners, for whatever reason, change their position. People who were the most zealous and the most uncompromising, start talking about civil society and the rule of law, and all of these things, phrases which meant nothing. Now, does that mean anything? When I heard that, I recall the famous Persian poet Obaid Zakani, who talked about the cat, and he said, "Gorbe ta'ib shod, abidu zahidu musalmana." The cat has repented and is now a believer and a Muslim. Well, maybe the cat doesn't change. It doesn't change. But these people do seem to change. I think of some of the people who held us hostage, who turned out 20 years later to be reformists, and they're the ones who kept talking about democracy. I mean, did I believe them? Probably not. But people can change. People can change their view. People can change their views.
One more question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. I'm of the view that the United States of America, the government of the United States, has a unique moral responsibility toward the people of Iran, to defend the people of Iran and to support their democratic aspirations. Because we in the United States, American taxpayers, overturned what was arguably Iran's best prospects for democracy in the 1950s. In other words, it's interesting to contemplate and ask the question, where might Iran be today had the CIA not toppled the Mossadegh government? How different might that country be? How different might the Middle East be? How different might the Islamic world be had there been a consolidated democracy in the heart of the Middle East or the Islamic world? We know that the United States did this because someone affiliated with this university, Madeleine Albright, as you recall, in March of 2000, publicly sort of came pretty close to admitting that the United States toppled Mossadegh and did it for Cold War reasons. So this, I think, establishes some sort of historical claims, or responsibility at least, on the part of the United States toward Iran and toward its people, given this, I think, tragic intervention that set the stage for the '79 revolution. I mean, it's 40 years. This is what our lecture series is about, looking back over 40 years. As we heard a few weeks ago with Ervan Abrahamian, you can't understand 1979 unless you understand 1953. And 53 is the key, I think, point of departure that set the stage for '79. And so it's a legitimate question, I think, to ask in terms of looking back at historic mistakes, historic injustices, responsibility that needs to be owned by American government officials toward countries. I could make the argument that Iran's entire political trajectory was deeply distorted and was deeply perverted by virtue of that intervention. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sometime in November or December of 1979, after we were captured, one of the Iranians who captured us was questioning me, and his first question was, "What was your role in the events of August 1953, the treacherous coup?" And I said, "Well, my role was definitely a minor one because I was 10 years old at the time." You're right, but you're right about history. History. That's why I love history. I'm a historian, as I said, by training. And if you forget, if you don't pay attention to it, it comes back. I always like to talk about the ghosts of history. There are these ghosts out there that haunt the relationship, and one of them is the ghost of 1953. And if you ignore it, it still haunts you, and it's still there. You know, what's the famous phrase? Those who forget history are condemned to repeat sophomore year. Anyway, that's what I tell my students. That's what I tell my students. It gets their attention. It gets their attention. No, it's all that it's all there. The question, though, is, you know, okay, it happened. It happened. Are we and the Iranians going to beat each other over the head indefinitely over these grievances? Because they exist. They exist. I mean, the Iranians can talk. They can talk about 1953. They can talk about the status of forces agreement that was forced on the Iranians in 1964. They can talk about the Airbus that was shot down. We can talk about Beirut. We can talk about the captives. We can talk about the hostage crisis. We can do this. And I was in a meeting. This was after I left government service. The permanent representative of Iran, the Islamic Republic in New York, invited me for lunch, and we had a very nice lunch. And then he started going in about all of these things that the United States had done. And finally, I said, "Sir, since I'm not, if I were still with the government, I would have to answer you point by point. But I'm not with the government. So let me just say this. What's the point of this mutual recrimination? You have your grievances against us. We have grievances against you. But I see no. It's like a husband and wife in a bad marriage. You just keep going after each other." You know what he said? This was really interesting. He said, "You're right." He said, "What's the point of gelegozari?" was the word he used, meaning mutual recrimination. What's the point of that? And then he paused for a minute and he said, "Yes, but why did the United States do this, and that?" At the end of the day, hard to get. It's a trap. But I personally am no fan of the Islamic Republic. I mean, I would love to see you, Nader, and my friends, my good Iranian friends, my Iranian relatives, to have a government that treated them decently, that didn't throw journalists in jail, that didn't go after human rights lawyers, that didn't imprison and murder environmentalists, for God's sake. I would love to see that. But then, at the same time, what, as we as Americans, as non-Iranians, what is our legitimate purpose? The history of this, the history of our interfering or our meddling with good intentions to determine the government of another state, it's not a good record. I served in Iraq. I served in Iraq twice. And believe me, what I saw there, I think, Ambassador Grappo, you served there. I don't know if you share this view, but what I saw there said, this was not going well. With all the good intentions in the world, it wasn't going well. So yes, we have this responsibility. What's more important, I think, is the acknowledgement of it, and to say, we did this, and it was not right. It was not a good. It was not a good thing, and I think that's where Madeleine Albright came out. That's where I think President Obama came out, and I would love to see on the Iranian side some of the same thing, particularly in terms of what happened to us. Because as long as people there claim, well, this was a good thing, we did this, we did that, and pretend that it was a good thing, it's going to be very difficult to make any progress or change anything in the relationship.
Thank you. Let's take some questions from the audience. Before we take the first question, the standard rules apply. If you want to identify yourself, you can, but keep your questions in the form of a question. Please avoid long speeches or you will be cut off. So raise your hand and, okay, Mujtaba right here at the front, first question.
Salam, man Mujtaba Agha Mohammadi Moji Agha, if you remember me with Iran Peace in the Middle project, which I've had to suspend because of the situation. And to talk about, I've been asking as a cultural person, psychologist trained in understanding culture. I've been asking, what is it that two actors are after? And one is Israel, which wants Iran to be a failed state, apparently, especially the right-wingers, and Iranians who want some kind of a nuclear weapon capability in order to, I ask myself, what? And what I can get to, and I would like your comment on that, so that it's a question as opposed to a long speech. So please don't cut me off.
You're getting close.
Yes, I know. I think that the ethos for wanting, for the Shia clerics want to prove that the religion of Islam, in their interpretation, is capable of surviving and thriving in a modern environment. To prove a historical point that, because they've been told that your religion is backward and all that stuff. So I'm thinking that maybe there is a relationship between the Israeli desire to make sure that Iran is a failed state on the one hand, and the Iranian desire to prove, the Shia cleric desire to say, we are civilized, we are not savages. Comment, please.
You know, you're really, that's really far beyond my understanding of things. I am very reluctant to impute motives to people. People do what they do. And if you say he did this because of X or because of Y, I don't know. I find that very dangerous to go on. What I do know is that this: within Israel, in my experience, there is a very vigorous debate about Iran policy. As in Israel, there is a vigorous debate about most things. But within Israel, you find a lot of disagreement about it. Now, the government is, as you pointed out, is right wing. The other thing on the Iranian side, and I put this to a egregious failure of Iranian diplomacy, is they have played with this kind of rhetoric about wiping Israel off the map or destroying Israel or all whatever, however you interpret it. They have played right into the hands of the Israeli right wing and their allies around the world, in this country and around the world. The story I heard was that when President Ahmadinejad left office, Prime Minister Netanyahu went into mourning because he'd lost the best agent he ever had. I mean, he was the perfect enemy. He was the perfect enemy. You would always could depend on him to say something that would fire up the base. It was very interesting when President Rouhani came to the UN the first time. I think it was 2013. As part of his delegation, he included I forget the man's name, but he was the parliamentary representative of the Iranian Jewish community. In other words, a good understanding of symbolism. Now, one wishes that this kind of understanding and symbolism would continue and would take off, and people would understand how self-destructive this kind of this kind of rhetoric is.
Next question, maybe someone at the top. Joseph?
Hi, I'm Joe Dubroff. I'm a graduate of the Corbell School. I wanted to. You mentioned the Cube, I think, in talking about models for sort of ending hostility. One that sticks out to me though with Iran is China, due to China's foreign policy really being based off of facing the century of humiliation, and Iran also trying to overcome the humiliation it faced with the powers dividing it up and really colonizing and taking advantage of its resources. When you faced that episode in Tehran was a few years into the Nixon-initiated sort of reset of relations with the People's Republic. Do you think that there are any lessons that were being applied at that time from sort of seeing what was happening with China? I mean, starting in the 80s, what was happening with China to Iran policy, and do you think that any of that is being applied today, or are there any lessons that can be applied to U.S. policy towards Iran using the example of managing China's rise?
There should be. It's a good question. It's a good question. I mean, I'm not a specialist on China, but I think China doesn't they have a reference to the three great humiliations in Chinese history, and the parallels with Iran if you look at the last 200 years, that has been the history, and you can point to various things. At the same time, if you look at the last 100 years of Iran's history, it's really been a struggle to become masters in their own house, to take control of their own destiny, to get independence, to get dignity, and unfortunately, in most times, it's been a losing struggle. It's been a losing struggle, either outside powers or internal divisions have frustrated. The best example, the best thing I can find out of the China history, I'm not, as I said, I'm not an expert, was what Richard Nixon did. Now, I'm not an admirer of Nixon, but when he went to China, he did something very powerful, very simple, and very subtle. He took a yellow pad. People still used yellow pads in those days, and put a line down the middle, and on one side he wrote what they want, on the other side he wrote what we want. And he went into the negotiation with that in mind. Not like Mr. Pompeo, there was never another side of his yellow pad. And as a result, something, they got a product. Did we get everything we want? No. Did they get everything they want? No. But the relationship changed radically, and I must say, the world was a better place for it.
Okay, yeah, right here, Krista.
Hi, I'm looking at this map, and we've got friendships and we're allies with different people. We're involved militarily with different countries on this map, and it's just assumed that we should be for Saudi Arabia, that we should be involved in the Yemeni civil war, that we should back Israel 100% of the time, that we should be there in that way, and that we also should oppose Iran and oppose Hezbollah and oppose the Palestinians. It's just sort of assumptions that Americans make, and maybe there were reasons for that historically, there were reasons for that in the Cold War, but I'm wondering if those reasons still stand. Do we really need to be as involved in this region as we are? I know it's a huge question.
Well, I mean, I like your point about assumptions. Question them all. We need to question them all the time. And ask the question, why are we doing this? Why are we doing something else? Now, when I was growing up, it was the Cold War. and that was in the back of everything. So you mentioned the events of 1953. Those were justified on the basis if we had to keep the communists out of Iran, and away from Iran's oil, and away from warm water ports on the Persian Gulf. I mean, it sounds like very 19th century of us, but that's the way. But that's the way it was. But I agree with you. We should be questioning assumptions. What is our relationship with Saudi Arabia? What are the pluses? What are the minuses? I mean, I served there. There were a lot of pluses, but there were some. There are obviously some minuses. In the case of Iran, it's been the problem is we've been estranged for 40 years. And it's very difficult to ask the question, is that the best policy for us? Are we following a policy that brings the kind of results that we want? It's just now, it's become an assumption. It's become an assumption on both sides. Because we've forgotten how to do diplomacy. We've forgotten how to talk to each other, and when we try, we get frustrated. Things don't go well at the first defeat, and we say, "You see, you can't trust them. You can't deal with those people," and you find that on both sides. And over 40 years, what people have learned. It's like they have a toolkit in the back of their garage that's gone all rusty. They haven't used it. So what they've learned to do is we know how to bash each other, we know how to insult each other, we know how to threaten each other, and that we do pretty damn well, because that's what we've learned. But that's what we've learned, and I can tell you from experience, getting people to question that assumption is not easy. And very often it comes at a great personal cost. Basically, in my experience, people who questioned this sort of unremitting hostility toward Iran were seen as delusional. And that was one of the nicer words that's been used.
Before we go to the next question, let me just push you a little bit on this point. That the comparison with China and Nixon is interesting, but I think one of the big differences is that today, in the United States, the role that Iran plays in the American political imagination is, I think, very much different than China or even Cuba or even Vietnam. There are these reference points, these anchors that drag the relationship down. Part of it has to do with the hostages. Part of it has to do with the question of Israel and Iran's hostility toward Israel and support for Israel in this country. But part of it also has to do, I think, with the much more deep-seated cultural predisposition in this country against Islam and Muslims, and Iran being part of the Islamic world and representing some sort of cultural other. That, I think, makes it difficult for many Americans to contemplate a new sort of, relationship with Iran. And so when you look at it from that perspective, there are these, obstacles that exist that are unique to the U.S.-Iran relationship that I think inhibit getting out of this, this vicious cycle that didn't apply to the case of China that Joseph mentioned. Do you have any thoughts on how we overcome those particular problems?
I mean, look, in the case of China, we fought each other in Korea. There were thousands of dead on both sides. Mao lost his son to American bombing in Korea. In the case of Vietnam, how many thousands, tens of thousands, maybe millions of dead on both sides. I mean, if that isn't an obstacle, I don't know what is. In the case of Iran, what are we talking about? A couple of hundred, maybe, on both sides. If we add up the different, we talk about Beirut, and we talk about the Iran the Airbus, and all of these things. It is not the same thing. It is not the same thing. This is why it's so. This is why it's so difficult. I was telling Professor Grappo's class how when I teach my classes at the Naval Academy, my final exam question is, why are relations so bad, and why have they been so bad for so long? And that's my final exam question. And the students come to me and say, Professor, what's the answer? And I said, beats the hell out of me. I don't, it's why this thing has become so intractable. All those factors you mentioned are there, but I don't think, now I could be wrong about this, but I don't think in the American domestic political setting, I don't think Iran is really a big issue. People do not vote. People do not vote on foreign policy issues in this country very much. I think they did some surveys, and they found it was affected something like somewhere between 2 and 5% of the American electorate. I mean, we vote on many other issues. On many other issues, there is, and you see this in Washington. I certainly see this in Washington, where I live. There is a small group of people who are intensely interested in this subject, but in this country. But I would say about 30% of that group is here in this room tonight. It's not. That is not. I don't think it's determinative. I mean, if it were Islam, why do we? We have relations with dozens of Islamic countries. Good, bad, and indifferent. I mean, you can say maybe this is a good thing, maybe this is not a good thing. But I don't think there's anything inherent there. I think these wounds from the past are out there. People exploit them. People use them. People use them for their own political purposes. But as long as they fester, as long as they aren't dealt with, as long as they are not acknowledged, then it is difficult to do. But a lot of things about this relationship, to me, make no sense. They just do not add up, given comparison to other problems.
Let's take a few more questions if there are any. Right there, yeah, go ahead.
So I had 2 different questions, and we can cycle around or can fire them both at once. But one is probably, so my name is Michael Neal. I was a alum of Pure at Corbell. And one is probably because I took way too many theory courses. But it occurred to me that not only is it a hodgepodge when you two were talking about what does the United States actually want, and is it a coherent set of demands and a coherent policy, it occurs to me that even if it is a set of demands that interlock in some way, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has any sort of overarching fundamental understanding of the relationship. It's not a realist relationship necessarily. It's not an idealist relationship necessarily. What sort of thinking is going on that produces these sort of demands? It seems as though it's just a hodgepodge that someone drew this out of this basket, this out of that basket, and et cetera, and put it together as a set of, we want this, at least in the Trump administration. And then the other question is, to go back to the 53 discussion, is there any way, not in the short term, but even in the long term, is there any way to go back from here? It's not as though I'm suggesting that you can undo 40 years of, 50 years of history, but can we go back to 53 in some way? Is there any desire or ability to do that within Iran?
Within Iran, you want to take that question about within Iran, about how Iran might be able to deal with 53? the 53 coup and
How-
try to advance relations?
How do you deal with, it's a good question sort of in general, how you deal with the how do you deal with the past? How do you go back and look at it? And Iran isn't obviously the only case. I mean, unfortunately, we see tragedies all over the world, and how to deal with it. And I'm a great believer in sort of fresh air, the healing effects of fresh air. I mean, air the things out. You could do, you could call together experts. You could call together, politicians, those who are still around, get them together in a room like this and talk about it. Here's what we did, and at least realize, that person on the other side is not a monster. That person on the other side had reasons, good or bad. They had reasons for what they did. Here's the problem: when two groups, or two people, or two neighbors, or two countries, when they don't talk to each other over a long period of time, what happens? The other side becomes simultaneously superhuman and subhuman. Think about that. Superhuman in the sense of capable of all kinds of evil, of the worst sort. The Iranians are capable of making a bomb. The U.S. is capable through the CIA of pushing a button and overturning the Islamic Republic. Superhuman, capable of anything. And listening to some of the rhetoric coming out today, that's what you're hearing. Superhuman. Subhuman, restrained by no morality, by no humanity, having no principles, having no limits, sort of the epitome of evil, the epitome of lies and mendacity. Now, what happens if the other side is superhuman? We fear them. If they're subhuman, we despise them. And that's a very dangerous and toxic mix, because it can justify, well, those people, they're capable of this, and they are limited. They are evil. They are limited by no sense of morality. Therefore, we are justified in taking any measure against them. And I think that's what we're up against.
We can maybe take one or two more questions if there are any. Start to wrap this up. It's supposed to snow this evening, and I live in South Denver. At the top.
Thank you so much. I just want to change the subject a little bit and look into the Iranian movement. So if you remember in 2009, during the Iranian Green Movement, people were yelling in the street, Obama, Obama, Yaba Una, Yabama, or Obama, you're going to be with the government or with us people. And some people believe that Obama didn't support Iranian people because there were the doors of negotiations opening with the government, so he didn't want to close these doors. But now, assume in the next year we have a movement in Iran going on. What would be a good reaction from Trump administration to these movements? I'm just curious to know your thoughts and your predictions about that.
No, your reference to 2009, that's an interesting one. And I know that President Obama came in for some heavy criticism for what he did or did not do during that period. To the extent that we saw what was to me a very distressing spectacle of the Secretary of State of our Secretary of State going to American University of Cairo a few months ago, and in front of a foreign audience criticizing the previous administration. And this is just something you don't do. You know, you just simply don't. You don't do that. You don't say, and then say, and because what he is doing is discrediting himself, and that was one of the things that was one of the criticisms. The problem there is coming back to what he said. What the president did was to endorse the principle of, yes, we support human rights everywhere. That includes Iran, that includes Egypt, that includes everywhere. The people have this right they have the right to speak up, they have the right to a government that treats them decently. But the idea of meddling in Iranian politics, I think, was in general a very bad idea. And I also would point out that some of the people associated with the Green Movement, with all due respect, had some very dubious pasts. And some of their so-called democratic credentials were not necessarily the best. And the question is, do you want to get into the business of supporting those groups? So you keep it as you keep it as the principles. Basically, I think the view of the Iranian administration was, the Obama administration was, this is something for the Iranians to decide, and we are not going to determine what kind of government the Iranians had. Now, the Trump administration, I don't know what it would do. I don't know what it would do, but I will tell you this story that a few nights ago, I was in Washington. I was at a concert, an Iranian cultural event, and in the intermission, an Iranian-American gentleman came up to me and started telling me how much he liked the president's policies, and how much he appreciated all the pressure that he was putting on the Iranians. He said, you should do more, you should give more pressure, you should put on more sanctions, you should do this, you should threaten more, you should do all these things. And finally I said to him, sir, if you like our president so much, I'd be very willing to send him to Iran, send him to you. And his response was, no, please don't do that. Please don't do that. But again, I find it very difficult to when Secretary Pompeo expresses sympathy for the aspirations of ordinary Iranians, I find it very difficult to believe him. For example, I mean, just to give you an example, we have this so-called Muslim ban. Makes it very difficult for people to travel. Now, is somebody's grandmother a threat? You know, how is the United States more secure because your grandmother cannot travel from Iran to come and see you, or you can't go there because if you try to come back, you'll have problems. I just find this not believable, and it falls into the category of feel-good diplomacy.
Let me just take an adaptation on that question. I think what he's trying to get at and trying to highlight is that Iranian citizens, particularly young people, right, are frustrated, are broken, are disillusioned over their political and social conditions. It's been 40 years. There was a lot of hope that Rouhani and the nuclear agreement would lead to something better, right, an opening. That's collapsed. Iranians are caught between sort of an oppressive regime on the one hand and Trump's sanctions on the other. You know, what can the international community, what can the United States, what can a future president who, you know, at least has some democratic credentials and some human rights credentials, what could a future leader of this country do that could be more supportive of the democratic aspirations of Iranians living within the country? I think that's really the core of the question.
Well, I mean, there are some obvious things. You stop, you stop threatening. You stop accusing, and you get back. You make an attempt to do something to find a path that is more productive. First of all, you decide, what do we want? And as I said, this administration hasn't done that. If you decide what you want, then the question is, how do you get there? What's productive? Is it productive to threaten? Is it productive to put on more sanctions? That's the kind of that's the kind of argument. The frustration of ordinary people is heartbreaking. It really is. But on the other hand, you realize that what a foreign country can do to help that is very limited. At the end of the day, and it's whether it's Iranians or Egyptians or whatever, they're going to have to work out their destiny. And my prescription in foreign policy, it's like being a doctor. Do no harm. At least stay out. At least if you can't do it, if you can't find something, if you can't do something positive, if your hands are tied or your means are limited, do no harm. And unfortunately, too often, when we have gotten into these situations, and again, I go back to my experience in Iraq, we have done harm, and the results have been that. The results have been that way. I don't have any miracle. On the other hand, people tell me that the Iran that I knew, and I haven't not been there for 39, 40 years, not by choice. I'd love to go. I'd love to take my children and grandchildren there to see it, but I'm not welcome. And I'm not welcome because I think I remind them of something they would not rather forget. But the Iran that I knew has changed. It's different. It's gone. It's not the same. It's not the same country. And you have a people who are savvy, who are well educated, who are in touch with the world, who know what's going on. And if you look at the cultural flowering that's going on, look at the film industry that's come out of Iran. Look at the art that's come out of it. That's come out of Iran. Look what Iranian Americans have done in this country. In this country, it's absolutely amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And somehow you have to tap into that creativity and that ability, and that you encourage, and you don't encourage it, frankly, with travel bans.
Ambassador Gilbert, these are dark and gloomy days for, the politics in this country, the politics in Iran, and the politics between the two countries. But your presence here tonight has really tried to shed some light on these dark questions and these dark relations. And on behalf of our Center for Middle East Studies, I want to thank you for being with us tonight and sharing with us your thoughts. Please join me in thanking Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.